Welcome, my friends, to your set of videos for Unit 2. Make sure you understand what your video homework type is, and I'll see you at the end of the notes. Wow, this is Unit 2. Oh my gosh, You're about to embark on Unit 2 videos with Miss I. Get ready, cause it's gonna be awkward and... Alrighty, so we are gonna go and look at the decline of classical civilizations today. And our one main objective for this video is answering essentially this one question, but obviously there are 3 questions with that, which is what causes empires to collapse? What are the short-term, medium terms, long-term problems, as well as what are the internal and external problems with a collapsing? So let's go ahead and get started by looking at the decline of the Persian or the Achaemenid Empire. Okay, so we've already seen how the Achaemenid Empire fell to 2 main events. We saw how the Persian Wars affected them, as well as Alexander of Macedon. The wars weakened the empire just as Alexander of Macedon was becoming ambitious, invaded, and captured this empire. If you need a refresher, go back to video number 1. So next, we have the decline of the Han Dynasty, specifically with the XIONGNU peoples. So the greatest foreign challenge that the Han faced came from the XIONGNU, a nomadic peoples from the steppes, which is a geographical setting, of Central Asia. And for the Han Dynasty, they would have come from the northern parts of their empire. And these individuals spoke a Turkish language. The XIONGNU were excellent horsemen, to the point where boys learned to ride sheep and they would shoot rodents at a very, very early age, and they would practice that skill. And as they grew older, then obviously they would be on larger animals, most likely horses, and they would aim their bows and arrows at much larger prey. Their mobility did offer them a distinct advantage, however. When they could not satisfy their needs and desires through peaceful trade, they mounted sudden raids into villages or trading areas where they commandeered food supplies or manufactured goods and then rapidly departed. Because they had no cities or settled places to defend, the XIONGNU could quickly disperse when confronted by a superior force. With its highly disciplined army, the XIONGNU Empire was a source of concern to the Han emperors. During the early days of the dynasty, they attempted to pacify or try to keep the XIONGNU calm, ease at bay by paying them tribute, or by arranging marriages between the ruling classes of the Han peoples and the XIONGNU peoples in hopes of creating some sort of peaceful diplomatic relations. Neither of these tactics worked for very long, as we'll see in just one moment. So looking at the internal decay of the Han state. So the Han dynasty collapsed largely because of internal problems that its rulers could not solve. It's a pretty common theme throughout our various classical empires. One problem involved the development of factions within the ranks of the ruling elites. So marriage alliances between imperial and aristocratic families led to the formation of these factions whose members sought to advance their prospects in the imperial government and exclude others from important positions. That atmosphere led to constant fighting and backstabbing among the ruling elites, which in turn reduced the effectiveness of the central government. Another difficult problem was that of land and that distribution. There was an attempt to redistribute land in China, but it did not successfully work. During the last 2 centuries of the Han Dynasty, large landowners gained new influence in the government. They managed to reduce their share of taxes and shift the burden onto the peasants. And speaking of peasants, right? So that change provoked widespread unrest, particularly among the peasants who found themselves under increasing economic pressure with no means to influence the government. Economic pressure equals taxes. Pressures became partially acute during the late 2nd and 3rd centuries when epidemics began to take a toll. In 184 CE, peasant discontent fueled an immense uprising known as the Yellow Turban Rebellion. Called because the rebels wore yellow headbands that represented the color of the Chinese earth and symbolized their peasant origins. The authorities were able to suppress the rebellion, but it became a huge example and reminder of what could happen to the Han government. And speaking of the government, looking at the collapse of the Han dynasty. So Han generals increasingly usurped political authority, or in other words, they kept on gaining more and more power. They were undermining their orders, etc. By 190 CE, the Han Emperor had become a puppet, and the generals effectively ruled the regions controlled by their armies. They allied with wealthy landowners of their regions and established themselves as warlords who maintained a kind of rough order based on force of arms. The generals continued to recognize an emperor for a short time, but in 220, they formally abolished the Han dynasty and divided the empire into 3 large kingdoms, as you see right here. Once the dynasty had disappeared, large numbers of nomadic peoples migrated into China, especially from the northern regions, and that essentially helped to keep China disunited. So now we're going to shift over to India with the decline of the Mauryan Empire. So looking back at Ashoka, if you remember him, his policies in regards to his laws that incorporated Buddhist ideas did not survive long after he died. And when he died in 232 BCE, it essentially declined immediately, the empire, excuse me. During its later years, the Mauryan Empire suffered from acute financial and economic difficulties. The empire depended on a strong army and a large administration team. Salaries for both soldiers and bureaucrats were expensive. Eventually, those administrative costs outstripped the revenues that flowed into the central treasury. And so later, Mauryan emperors often resorted to the tactics of debasing their currency. And by doing that, they reduced the amount of precious metal in a coin without reducing its normal value. And because of that, specifically with their financial difficulties, they're unable to hold the entire realm together. All right, going to the Greek city-states. So once again, we've already looked at how the Greek city-states declined, but just as a little mini reminder, it mainly occurred due to internal strife, right? With the Peloponnesian Wars, the Athenians and the Spartans were the main perpetrators fighting each other. Then you have the invader, Alexander of Macedon, coming in, taking advantage and conquering the area. Once again, if you need a refresher of this, go back to video number 3 and 4. That'll definitely help you out. Alrighty, so now looking at the decline of the Roman Empire. It's a pretty big chunk of this video here. So many individuals fascinated with the Roman Empire have sought to explain the fall of it as the result of some single simple cause. But in reality, there is no single reason as to why the Roman Empire had a decline and eventually fell. By various accounts, the Roman Empire declined and fell because there was evidence of lead poisoning in the waters, radiation from the bricks, immortality from various fightings, epidemics, and as well as the rise of Christianity. Instead, a combination of internal problems and external pressures weakened this empire and brought an end to the Roman authority in the western half of it. And we'll look and see exactly what that means in just a moment. Imperial rule continued until the 15th century or the 1400s in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. So let's set the stage by looking at the barracks emperors. So just like the Han Dynasty, internal political problems go a long way towards explaining the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman emperors faced internal opposition. Between 235 to 284 CE, there were 26 recognized emperors. They are known as the Barracks emperors, and most of them were generals who seized power, held it for a brief amount of time, and then suddenly lost it when they were displaced by rivals or by their various troops. Apart from divisions and factions, the Roman Empire faced problems because of its sheer size as well. And this is the map kind of showing you how huge it is. How huge it was. Even during the best of times, when the emperors could count on abundant revenues and disciplined armed forces, this sprawling empire posed a challenge for central governors. After the 3rd century, as epidemics spread throughout the empire and its various regions moved towards local, self-sufficient economies, the empire as a whole essentially became not meaningless, but it started to become less reliable for the peoples. We're going to focus on 2 emperors after the Barrack emperors, and the first one is Diocletian over here. So Emperor Diocletian, wow, what a face, ruled from 284 to 305, and he attempted to deal with this land problem specifically by dividing the empire into 2 administrative districts, as you see right here. So he essentially divided up into a western half in this reddish color and the eastern half by this orangey color. A co-emperor ruled each district with the aid of a powerful lieutenant. And Diocletian hoped that these 4 officials, who are known as the tetrarchs, and that's what this statue is to your right, would be able to administer the vast empire more efficiently than the individual empire could. And so in the end, his tetrarch turned into this map that you see here, divided up into, technically for this map, 4 different regions, but in reality, it was still divided up in half, Western versus Eastern. So our other emperor we're going to look at is Constantine over here. And this is me. Well, this isn't me, but this is Constantine. This is just a picture that I took when I went to go see one of the few remaining ginormous statues of Constantine left. So Diocletian's reforms of the army and economy also encouraged ambition among the 4 top co-rulers and their generals, and his retirement, so he didn't die, he retired from office, Diocletian, essentially set off a round of internal struggle and bitter civil war. When Constantine came into the picture, 306 CE, he was the son of Diocletian's co-ruler, I'm going to go back here for a second, who is Constantius. And this part, this yellowy part, is exactly what Constantius ruled over. Britannia, Gaul, region as well. So when Constantine came into power, he essentially moved in to stake the claim as a sole emperor. So he didn't like the idea of dividing up the empire. He just wanted to have the power all for himself. And so by 313, he had defeated most of his enemies who were trying to take the throne. Once he had consolidated his grip on power, Constantine ordered the construction of a new capital city, Constantinople, on the eastern half of the Roman Empire. And Constantinople is at this very strategical point between the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara, which will turn into the Mediterranean Sea. During this time, he is the first emperor to convert to Christianity, and he essentially made this religion the sole religion of the empire. There's this tale of how essentially he was trying to fight some wars, some battles, I think in Gaul, which is present-day France, and he essentially called out to the heavens saying, if Christianity is really a thing, give me a sign to say that I can win this battle. And apparently he saw a sign where one of the angels came down with the cross saying, yes, you can win. So you might be thinking, why and how could a religion essentially ruin an empire? Well, one of the main reasons why this was seen as not a too great of a thing for an entire empire to convert to a new religion is because of those previous persecutions that we've looked at before. So you're going from a country that persecuted this religion to all of a sudden accepting it and forcing people to be part of that religion. And as we're going to see without and throughout history, forcing individuals to do certain things is not the best way to actually rule an empire. So after 330, Constantinople became the capital of a united Roman Empire. And Constantine was a pretty decent emperor. He wasn't really terrible. But with the reunion of the eastern and western districts of the empire, he and his successors faced the same exact problems that Diocletian attempted to solve by dividing the empire. So essentially, Constantinople reversed everything that Diocletian tried and hoped to do. As population declined and the economy contracted, emperors found it increasingly difficult to marshal the resources needed to govern and protect the vast Roman Empire. Germanic migrations. So you have these peoples, and hopefully this map can kind of help you understand which peoples are from where are they coming from, how is it affecting the empire, etc. So these Germanic peoples had migrated from their homelands in northern Europe and lived on the eastern and northern borders of the Roman Empire since the 2nd century, so the 100 CE. So it's not really too uncommon, and they weren't like this unknown force. The Romans definitely did know about these peoples and this migration that was happening. The most notable peoples were the Visigoths, who originally came from the Scandinavia and Russian region. And like the nomadic peoples who moved into northern China after the fall of the Han Dynasty, the Visigoths settled, adopted agriculture, and drew deep inspiration from Roman society. They adapted Roman law to the needs of their society, for example, by converting to Christianity, and they even translated the Bible into the Visigoth language. In the interest of social order, however, the Romans discouraged settlement of the Visigoths and other Germanic peoples within the empire, preferring that they create buffer societies outside of the borders. The Huns. During the late 4th century, the relationship between the Visigoths and the Romans changed dramatically when this new force, the nomadic Huns, began an aggressive westward migration from their homeland in Central Asia. They're most likely a cousin of the XIONGNUs, who were part of the invading force for the Han Dynasty. One of their most famous emperors, or war king, was Attila the Hun, where he organized the Huns into a virtually unstoppable military force, and he invaded and attacked the Roman provinces. Attila did not create a set of political institutions or a state structure, and the Huns disappeared as a political and military force soon after his death in 453. By that time, the Huns had placed such pressure on the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Franks, and other Germanic peoples that they streamed in masses into the Roman Empire in search of refuge. Once inside the boundaries, they encountered little resistance and moved around the empire. They established settlements throughout the western half of the empire, where populations were less dense than the eastern Mediterranean. By the middle of the 5th century, the western part of the Roman Empire was in ruin. Unlike the Han Dynasty, the Roman Empire did not entirely disintegrate. Imperial authority survived for another 1,000 years in the eastern half of the empire, which was renamed into the Byzantine Empire, which we'll look at more so in our next unit. In the western half, Roman authority gradually dissolved, and nomadic peoples built successors states in regions formerly subject to Rome. So the Vandals, then the Visigoths, governed Spain. The Franks ruled Gaul. The Angles and Saxons invaded and ruled Britain. And Italy fell under a variety of different peoples. And that is where we're going to end it for today. So, what do we learn? That is what I'm expecting you to answer. So remember, try to answer this objective question using all of the information that you have learned from this video. That was some pretty inspirational stuff, right? Make sure that you understand what your homework type is. And if you have any questions, you know exactly how to reach me. Goodbye, good luck, and I'll see you next time.